Okay, here it is. Here's the sample question. So this is what it's going to look like, guys, exactly. It's going to have this little reminder of the rubric up top, just in case you need it. But of course, it's open note, so you could have that next to you if you wanted to. It is only 45 minutes and then 5 minutes to submit it. More on that later, but like 1 minute late is no credit. Okay, so I really wanted you guys to stick to 45 minutes and then give yourselves 5 minutes to upload it. So those of you turning it in at 1:51, 1:52, you probably took the whole 50 minutes to write it and then uploaded it, and you cannot do that next week. Okay, let's read this question. Please tell me that you all read this question at least like 5 times. You have to read the question super carefully, know exactly what it is you're supposed to be doing. When I wrote this, I not only read the question 5 times, but I kept referring to it throughout when I was writing it, just to make sure that I was right on top of what they were asking. So here you're looking for indigenous peoples' reactions to state expansion. So you're looking at how natives reacted to imperialism. Now, be very careful. It's evaluate the extent, we've seen a lot of those, to how these reactions differed during the period 1750 to 1900. So your thesis should hopefully say something on the lines of, native reactions to imperialism were very similar, or native reactions to imperialism were very different, or although they were similar in these ways, they were different in these ways. All of that format gets to what that prompt is, about how this is a compare and contrast prompt. We've mainly done cause effect so far during the year. This was compare contrast. So you're going to see that when I show you mine, I use the although format. The although there were these similarities, there were these differences. And that way you're capturing the nuance, the extent of how their reactions were similar or different. Okay. Again, this is exactly what it's going to look like for you guys next week. There's going to be 5 documents. I think they're all going to be this length too, not super long. There's going to be 1 image. So this is exactly what it's going to look like. What I did was I read through these documents, and then when on a separate document, like blank document, I just took some brief notes, like jotting down annotations of my reactions to them. So for example, for document 1, I was like, rejecting imperialism, but does so nicely and politely. That's basically what I wrote down for 1. Document 2, I wrote like Korean Confucians form army to resist imperialism. I'm just trying to write down like big categories so that I can group them and see the connections later. And then when I'm actually writing the essay, I'll be able to say more about them. For document 3, we saw this one during our month of practice. So document 3, I wrote Ethiopians get weapons to fight off Europeans. For document 4, I said Queen of Hawaii is nice and polite, talking to the president, trying to resist imperialism. And finally, document 5 is the only one that doesn't really fit. I'm sure you guys felt the same way too. It's not super similar or different from the others. It's more just she's writing about sort of the cultural imperialism of Europeans, or how they appropriated Javanese culture, how they expected natives, even aristocrats, to be very deferential to them. So I kind of wrote that. I wrote like native doesn't like imperialism due to cultural issues or something like that. Okay, so then once I did that, I was able to think, okay, well, all of these are, against imperialism and resisting imperialism. So they're all similar in that they're reacting against imperialism. Okay, but you're going to have more than that in a thesis. So they're different in that some use diplomacy and niceness and politeness to do it. Some use military means, whether it's acquiring weapons or forming this righteous army. And some write letters, some, I guess she was trying to influence the education system. Some are trying to assert independence, but focusing more on cultural issues. So at the end of the day, I'm assuming, I would like to think that most of you kind of had a thesis like that. Some responded like peacefully and diplomatically, some responded violently. You just kind of have that basic dichotomy, and that absolutely answers the question about the extent to which they were similar or different. Okay, so let's go on over here to what you could have written down. Now, first, real quick reminder. I know you guys have been reading about the rubric every week, and we kind of did lessons to practice the skills. But here together, all at once, let me show you the rubric and where the 10 points come from. All right, you get 1 point for the thesis. That's like normal. 1 point for context. That's like normal. You get 5 points for evidence. So the first evidence point is just that like you talk about 2 documents and like you're right about what you say about them. I mean, that's it. It should be something everybody gets across the nation. Then you get another point if you actually use those, even if the same 2 documents, if you use 2 documents and they actually support your thesis, if you actually link them to your thesis, that's a whole nother point. If you're able to take 4 of the 5 documents, or of course 5 documents, and link them to your thesis, that's a whole nother point. So you get up to 3 points for hopefully using 4 of the 5 documents and using them to prove and back up your thesis. And then the other 2 evidence points come from outside evidence. Just as long as they're relevant to the prompt. Anything, and it has to be more than a word or a phrase. So that's 7. And then finally, the last 3 points are doing the sourcing. I tried to introduce to you guys, you could think of sourcing as doing a HIP analysis. HIP standing for historical context, intended audience, purpose, or point of view. If you can do a HIP analysis for 1 document, you get a point. For a second document, you get a point. And then finally, they still have that nebulous, complex understanding point. This is for students that write in a particularly sophisticated way, for students who are able to introduce lots of outside evidence instead of just those 2 points. For students who are able to kind of skillfully show the nuance in the prompt and kind of write about although they were similar in these ways, they were different in these ways, and kind of do a good job grouping. That can be a way to get this. So anyway, that's the 10th and final point. So basically an outline, hopefully you guys started with an opening paragraph in which you contextualized and then lead that into the thesis, just like we've been doing all year. That has not changed. Then you're going to write body paragraphs. There's no right number, but probably about 2 is what you'll have time for. You could start each one with a topic sentence that relates clearly back to your thesis. That'll get you organized as to what you're supposed to be writing about. That'll help the reader to know exactly what you're trying to do. It'll help you to earn those evidence points. Then you actually discuss the documents as evidence. Then right after you use a document as evidence, you can source it. Remember, you only have to do that twice. And then finally, somewhere in those paragraphs, or it could be in its own paragraph, you're going to want to bring in pieces of outside knowledge. That's it. That's it. That is the outline right there. You do not have to save time for a closing paragraph. It doesn't matter whatsoever. It will not affect your score 1 iota. That is not in the rubric. Okay. So again, this was my attempt, and it doesn't mean this is the only right answer. I just wanted to show you an example to talk through, and you guys can kind of ask me about your own later. But I saw this one as basically like the exact same context as what I would have done if I was writing the railroad DBQ that we wrote back in like February. That one was about evaluate the impact of railroads on imperialism. Well, this was an imperialism essay, right? So you could have, like, where does imperialism come from? Would have been a good way to contextualize here. So I wrote, the period 1750 to 1900 saw industrialization in Western Europe and then in the US and Japan. Industrialization was a shift to mass producing goods with machines. Western economies needed cheap sources of raw materials for the factories and then markets for the finished goods. We've been saying that over and over and over. Colonies could help with these goals. So that is why industrialization was a major factor that explains imperialism in the 19th century. Okay, so there you go. How many, that was what, like 3 sentences, maybe 4, contextualizing, setting up where this imperialism comes from. Now I'm going to link it to my thesis. As these world powers expanded, they had to deal with a variety of reactions by the indigenous peoples they sought to rule. And now here's my structure where I tried to do the although. So remember, if the prompt is, no, not that. The prompt is evaluate the extent to which they were different. I'm going to capture that by saying, although indigenous peoples universally expressed a desire to resist imperialism, so although they were all against imperialism, the forms this resistance took differed greatly. So although they were similar in this way, they were different in these ways. Some indigenous peoples relied on diplomacy, others advocated violent resistance, others focused on cultural appropriation. Spoiler alert, when I was writing it and I started running out of time, didn't even get to this one. Didn't back up this part of my thesis at all. I was only able to use 4 of the 5 documents, and that's fine. Okay, so here you go though. I have set a roadmap with this thesis, right? I have set a roadmap that some are resisting imperialism with diplomacy, some are using violence, and some are focusing on cultural aspects. So I'm going to do 1 body paragraph per major thought in my thesis. And I'm going to use a topic sentence. I'm just going to copy what part of my thesis I'm going to write about. Let's do this part of my thesis first. Some indigenous peoples relied on diplomacy. So I wrote for my first body paragraph, some indigenous peoples chose diplomacy in the face of imperialism. Now it's time to use the documents as evidence. Do you guys agree with me that document 1 and document 4 were similar? Perhaps you grouped them yourself, that they were about using diplomacy to counter European imperialism, or I should say Western imperialism. In document 1, the Ashanti leader rejects the British proposal to rule Ashanti. The leader uses polite language and asserts that they seek to remain on friendly terms. That's it. I use it as evidence. Now I'm going to attempt to source it right here. The polite language of this document comes from where? So I'm going to talk about what shaped the polite language of this document. The Ashanti leader is trying to adhere to British norms. Like what I'm trying to say is they're trying to play the British game, hoping that being diplomatic and respectful will achieve their goal of independence. That's kind of what I was trying to say there. They're trying to play by British rules and play the British game, hoping that the British will respect that and leave them alone. I kind of did a second source in here for those of you who thought of it this way. Also, the reason the Ashanti leader is being so nice and diplomatic is they know that Great Britain is much more powerful. There's a great power imbalance between Great Britain and Ashanti, mainly due to guns and weapons. In fact, I should have included that. That was my mistake. And this is why they're choosing diplomacy over war. So there I'm kind of sourcing by doing historical context. They're choosing to seek peace and diplomacy because they don't have the same weapons as Great Britain. That's like the H in HIP. Okay, similarly, in document 4, the Queen of Hawaii sends a diplomatic message to the American president and Congress, politely asking that they respect Hawaii's property and independence. Okay, why? I tried to do audience here. Who was the audience? It tells you in the source, it's the president and Congress, right? She is writing to the American president and Congress. So to me, this shaped her document because she's using words like justice, due process, protection of private property. She's using these like Enlightenment buzzwords, right? She's trying to appeal to the exact same phrases that you find in the American Declaration of Independence or Constitution, right? Kind of trying to speak their language and talk to them on their own terms, why they should respect Hawaii and leave it alone. So there you go. That was a paragraph in which I used document 1 as evidence, I used document 4 as evidence, and I sourced them both. So now the next part in my essay was sometimes instead of peace, they advocated violent resistance. So now I'm going to have a violence paragraph. Other indigenous peoples chose to resist through warfare. So I grouped documents 2 and 3 together. Just trying to bring up the fact that they're resorting to war. Document 3 shows us the Ethiopians resisted Italians in battle. Close inspection of the painting reveals that the Ethiopians attained modern weapons, such as heavy artillery and machine guns to help them win. Okay, that's it. How would you source something like this? So I wrote it this way. One should be cautious with this document, however. Why? You could have said, because the painting is from an Ethiopian source who is likely trying to inspire Ethiopians to join the resistance. Maybe he made it look like Ethiopia was more successful than they really were in the battle. Okay. Or you could say, this painting only tells the story of one battle. It does not necessarily portray what Ethiopian resistance looked like always. Like maybe throughout the years of fighting off the Italians, they were mainly unsuccessful. Maybe certain regions fared better than others. You know, we're really only getting the story of one battle, so we can't necessarily use that as then hard proof that the Ethiopians gathered modern weapons like super successfully for the whole time. All right, and then I tried to link it to document 2. Along the same lines, document 2 tells us that a group of Korean nationalists formed something called the Righteous Army to resist imperialism in Korea. That's pretty much all I say for document 2. So I said here, the document's purpose is to achieve Korean independence. So this is why it's appealing to nationalism. What the author is doing is they're speaking to other Korean soldiers who may be of a different religion or different political group, but here, this Tonghak group is appealing to nationalism. They're trying to highlight the similarities between them and other Korean groups rather than their differences to secure their cooperation to achieve Korean independence. So if that's their audience is other Koreans, if their purpose is Korean independence, how does that shape the document? That's why they are focusing on nationalism and like commonalities between them. Okay, at this point, before I get down to my last paragraph here, I have used 4 of the documents as evidence. I think I did sourcing 4 times, only so that I would have more examples to show you guys. You would only have to do it twice. So that would save you time. Because I did it all those times, I ran out of, I had like maybe 5 minutes left, and I still had to do my outside evidence. So I just completely skipped it and ignored document 5. So I want to tell you, I mean, I know all year long, I was like, oh, when you write a DBQ, you have to do all 7 documents. What if you get one wrong? And I'm sure throughout this last month, I'm saying, oh, you got to do all 5, because what if you get one wrong? But man, you save a lot of time by ignoring one of the documents. So I learned today that that's a valuable strategy that you guys could do is you know, just focus on 4 documents. It's okay to leave out the 5th if you're getting tight on time. So anyway, I tried to go through, and there's a ton of examples of, I'm just trying to think of any other example of how natives resisted imperialism from that period. And just, could I write a couple of sentences about that? So I kind of did the strategy for outside evidence of, did these examples make me think of anything else? Like, was there another example of violent resistance to imperialism I could have used? Or was there another example of natives using diplomacy and peace? So I came up with these examples. One, I said, similar to the Tonghak movement in Korea, there was the Chinese boxer movement. That was probably one of our last days in class together. I was doing that Boxer Rebellion Day, in which the boxers used appeals to religion and nationalism to encourage people to rise up against foreign imperialism. The boxers were inspired by native Chinese beliefs and Taoism. They blamed Western expansion for messing up China, disrupting their land and their ancestor worship. So they eventually began to target Western railroads and missionaries and embassies and fight back. So here I brought up an additional piece of evidence relevant to the prompt that further answers the question. The Chinese boxers were similar in using violence. And then the other example I thought of was, could I think of another example of kind of using diplomacy? Or maybe kind of along the same lines, another group that maybe cooperated with the imperial power. So I thought Indian National Congress, which was, I know that was the group that would lead India to independence in the 1940s, but also that group started in the 1880s. So it fits in our time period here. The Indian National Congress was a group of middle and upper class Indians. They were Western educated. They spoke English. They dressed in suits. They spoke favorably about adopting British ways of life and adopting English and adopting a British education system. and they chose to cooperate with the British to prepare for an eventual peaceful independence. So that was my kind of strategy, was to think of another violent example and another peaceful example. You could have thought of a completely different one that was neither of those. And just because I had another one ready to go, I threw one more in here because I had like 1 minute left. I was thinking, I know that this is more of a US history thing, so I don't necessarily think a lot of you guys probably thought of this. But you could say that many natives in the Americas, like the American West, but the same thing happened in like Brazil or Argentina or Mexico, just anywhere where there were still native peoples. They also often chose diplomacy. Some of them chose war and fought back, but some of them chose diplomacy. They signed treaties. They agreed to live in reservations. They gave over land to white people. And some of the time they didn't really understand what they were signing, because they didn't really understand contracts. Some of the time they had no other choice because they didn't have the weapons to fight back. We actually did read something like that one day in class in the Human Record with Africa. We read about the British Royal Niger Company going around in Africa and getting the chiefs to sign over their land and sign over the mining rights and the agricultural rights to British people in exchange for protection over them. And we kind of talked about how that's kind of how they achieved imperialism, was kind of taking advantage of Africans, getting them to sign stuff they didn't really know, kind of giving them an ultimatum because they had stronger weapons. But this way they could conquer them without having to actually, conquer them.
And so me personally, my nigga, I actually jacked off 25,615 times. If you divide that by 17, I actually jacked off 1,500 times a year. So I just wanted to fucking let you guys.
Okay, let's just ignore that. Okay, good thing we were about almost done there. Hope they didn't disrupt your train of thought. That's it, by the way. So that I stopped there. We don't need a closing paragraph. So to recap, this is the outline I followed. Opening paragraph, context, thesis. Body paragraph, clear topic sentence, use the document as evidence, then source it. Use the document as evidence, then source it. You only have to do it twice. I chose to do a special paragraph at the end for my outside evidence, but it can really go anywhere in the paper. And I did make sure to do it twice because you need to do it twice for full credit. I did learn that I saved a lot of time by just ignoring a document that didn't fit as well as the other, so I ignored document 5, and that's totally fine. And I'm about to open it up to any questions if you guys want to talk it out or chat. But of course, right before logging on here, I did check my FCS Gmail to see, who turned it in late. And I mean, I had a ton of people turning it in between. If you turned it in at 1:50, that's fine. But there were maybe 20 to 30 people here that turned it in sometime between 1:51 or much later than that. And it's not that. I don't know how I'll deal with that for the purposes of this, but the point is on Thursday, that's not going to fly. So while you guys are taking the test, it will be 45 minutes. There's going to be a timer on your screen. When that timer hits 0, that you now know you only have 5 minutes to submit it. And if you do not have it fully submitted in time, if it's not fully gone through, email sent, 100% uploaded and in their hands by 2:50, it's not going to count and you're just out of luck. So let this be a lesson for those of you who turned it in at 1:52 or 1:53 or 1:54, that you do not want to do that in a few days. Okay, I guess I was talking kind of fast. I wanted to get through this, but let me stop sharing my screen and go back to if anybody wants to speak up or type out a chat.
Mr. Emerson.
Yes.
For document 3, for the sourcing, I wrote about how it was supposed to be destroying getting rid of preconceived notions of African inferiority, quote unquote, and it was mostly written for potential colonizer or drawn for potential colonizers to be hey, we're not actually all just sticks and rocks, we have guns.
Oh, very smart angle. So you're saying the audience was a European audience to make it look like the Ethiopians were a modern army. Yeah, absolutely. That's a good angle. That would totally count. I see a question here. How long should sourcing be? You know, that's obviously not a length thing, but I'm going to say at least 2 sentences and probably 3, because here's why. Remember, when you do sourcing, you have to identify, you basically have to identify what the hip factor is. Like, what is the intended audience? What is their point of view? What was the historical context? And then explain how that affected the document. So you can't really do that in 1 sentence. So like, I'll just do Ethan's that he just said. Like, you need to explain, like, so he would have had a sentence, the audience for this was potentially European imperialists. And this affected the document by the author wanted to show the Ethiopians as strong and able to resist European imperialism. So like that, you know, it's going to be a multiple sentence thing, because you've got to identify the hit factor, then explain how it affected the document. Okay, next question. What's the, let's back up to one before that. What's the difference between context and outside evidence? You know what? They're basically the same thing, because in order to contextualize, let me rephrase. Whenever you contextualize, you obviously have to bring in outside knowledge. So if you want to think of contextualization as like a third outside evidence point, you can. Yes, contextualization is outside of the document. It is your own knowledge. But there's no double dipping. So whatever you write for context does not then count for outside evidence. You have to come up with different outside evidence later in the paper. It just remember that the context is outside, typically you're connecting the paper to events or a process happening before the prompt, and outside evidence can be stuff like immediately relevant to the prompt. Okay, next question. Does outside evidence have to be in the same period as the one in the prompt? Yes. Yes, 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 yes. Outside evidence has to be in the same as the prompt. So for this one, you could not say like, oh, well, here's how the Gauls resisted Roman imperialism. You couldn't say, here's how the Arabs resisted Mongol imperialism. Like, nope, it has to be in the time period 1750 to 1900. So if you wrote about, here's how like the Inca or the Aztecs resisted the Spanish, no, it has to be in the time frame. Could we use the Haitian Revolution as outside evidence? Well, that's certainly in our time frame, because the Haitian Revolution was from roughly 1790 to 1804, something like that. So absolutely, it's in the time frame. The prompt is about state expansion. Haiti had been a French colony for, you know, like 200 plus years. I mean, I'd have to look at what exactly you wrote about it. But I'm probably just nitpicking and splitting hairs here. It would count. So if you wrote about like, how did the Haitians resist French imperialism at that time, whether it was the slave rebellion or whether it was like writing their kind of own Declaration of the Rights of Man and appealing to the Enlightenment, that'd be good.
Mr. Anderson, for document 2, I sourced Korea by talking about how like earlier Japan was expanding its sphere of influence and won the war against China, so it claimed Korea as like a colony and exploited its people and resources. Would that count as like kind of historical context that led up to their declaration and the rise of the army?
Yeah, let me double check the date here. Yeah, it says this was from 1894. That is right around, I'm pretty sure that was the first year of the first Sino-Japanese War. So to contextualize and say that Japan was a rising power at that time and they came into conflict with China and Korea was caught in the middle, I mean, that's perfect. So yeah, that would absolutely count. Anything else? Feel free to type it. If you want to just type it up on a private one, you can do that. Okay, good question. So this question is, does outside evidence have to be another example of resisting state expansion? Like, you have to come up with a totally new answer to the question off the top of your head? Or can it be elaborating on one of the documents, adding your own knowledge to show a deeper knowledge of that document? The answer is both. They both count. So if you wanted to add a completely different way that natives reacted to imperialism, you could have written about that. If you wanted to add another way they reacted peacefully, like the Indian National Congress, you could do that. If you wanted to add another way they reacted violently, like the Boxer Rebellion, you could do that. If you just wanted to take one of the documents and add even more details and knowledge about it, like I guess like what Tina just said, like if you wanted to, instead of sourcing document 2, if you added outside knowledge about Japanese imperialism at the time, and that helps to explain why there was anti-imperial movements in China or in Korea, then so like anything counts as outside evidence. It doesn't have to be, it can be like deepening an existing answer or a new answer, to put it simply. Very good questions. Anything else? Okay, while you guys are thinking about maybe any last questions, it's not too late, but I'm just gonna move on over to, now that I'm just speaking with you out loud, I will post this on Classroom for everybody who is not here. Only have about half the class here,